Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to brief the Council on the 9th report of the Secretary General on the threat posed by ISIL and United Nations efforts supporting member states in countering the threat. I would like to thank Under-Secretary General Vladimir Ivanovich Voronkov for providing an overview of the report, and to thank UN, OCT, and also the Analytical and Sanctions Monitoring Team for their collaboration with my team in preparing the report. The 9th report demonstrates that although welcome progress has been made, most significantly the military defeat of ISIL in the Syrian Arab Republic, the challenges involved in responding to the aftermath of that defeat, and the threat posed by affiliates around the world remain substantial. In particular, as we have heard from Secretary General Voronkov, member states and the international community should give urgent attention to the fate of thousands of individuals, including large numbers of women and children who are currently detained owing to their suspected association with ISIL. CTED will continue to support UN efforts to assist member states to address this issue in full respect for international law and human rights. And in parallel to possible repatriation efforts, states with the support of the UN system should also prepare to deal with the post-repatriation phase, issues of accountability, and the challenges involved in rehabilitation and reintegration. In this regard, member states have reiterated to CTED their concerns at the potential risk posed by the imminent release of imprisoned foreign terrorist fighters, both men and women, in the absence of appropriate rehabilitation and reintegration programs. Because of the short sentences given to many returnees owing to evidentiary and jurisdictional challenges, there may be limited opportunities to engage them in rehabilitation and reintegration programs prior to their release. In turn, extended periods of pre-trial detentions without guarantees of due process can undermine the effectiveness of rehabilitative measures and increase the potential risk that such individuals may radicalize others to violence within prison systems. Therefore, it's essential that post-repatriation strategies have short, medium, and long-term components relating to prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration. It's also essential that those strategies be human rights compliant and gender sensitive and take into consideration the special needs of children. This is not easy. And of course, there is no one-size-fits-all policy. And programs should instead be tailored to local conditions and allow for a case-by-case approach while still meeting applicable international law and upholding human rights. CTED continues to be fully engaged together with its partners in assisting states to address these challenges. One example of this is our work in the Lake Chad Basin, where we have been working with UNODC, IOM, UNDP, and other UN entities to help states develop regional approaches to screening, prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration as part of the regional stabilization, recovery, and resilience strategy for areas affected by Islamic State West African province. Our dialogue with member states has revealed that many other gaps and challenges remain in our efforts to understand and address counterterrorism and violent extremism. A particular challenge is to address the gender dimensions of terrorism and violent extremism. In February, CTED published a trends report on the gender dimensions of the response to returning foreign terrorist fighters. Significant knowledge gaps remain regarding the number and profiles of women who traveled to and returned from ISIL-held territory. It also notes that women tend to receive more limited rehabilitation and reintegration support, potentially putting them at greater risk of marginalization and recidivism. Furthermore, as terrorists continue to exploit the internet, social media, and messaging apps, practitioners need improved skills and updated tools to access critical evidence and help prosecute and secure the conviction of terrorist suspects in judicial proceedings. To help member states address those challenges, CTED, UNODC and the International Association of Prosecutors have developed the practical guide for requesting electronic evidence across borders, which helps practitioners at the national level to gather, preserve and share electronic evidence with the overall aim of ensuring efficiency in mutual legal assistance matters. Mr. President, terrorists also continue to demonstrate their interest in carrying out attacks targeting critical infrastructure and civilian or soft targets, including places of worship. CTED has identified the need for states to develop or expand existing national strategies and action plans to consider the risk and threat to such targets. Government and private sector partnerships are particularly essential to the protection of soft targets against terrorist attacks. This has been a topic of concern for the Security Council in June. The Counterterrorism Committee held an open briefing on this topic with member states, civil society and the private sector. The participants discussed ways to work together to prevent, protect, mitigate, respond to and recover from terrorist attacks against soft targets and their victims. It was noted that the development of responses from prevention to recovery should also involve close engagement with local leaders and communities. The Secretary General is also concerned by this trend, has tasked the Alliance of Civilizations to develop an action plan that supports member states in their effort to protect religious sites. Mr. President, another critical issue is victims of terrorism. As we have here last week, the UN held its second annual International Day of Remembrance of and tribute to the victims of terrorism. For too long, victims of terrorism have struggled to have their voices heard and their rights upheld. It's imperative that we can recognize and honor the victims and survivors of terrorism. And this requires of us that we ensure that the perpetrators of terrorist attacks are held to account. As the report makes clear, the United Nations investigative team to promote accountability for crimes committed by Daesh ISIL, UNITAD, has already made considerable progress in this regard in less than 1 year, including the first excavations of mass grave sites and the exhumation of victims' remains in Sinjar in northwestern Iraq. In April 2019, the Council adopted Resolution 2467 on sexual violence in armed conflict, which recognizes the victims of sexual violence perpetrated by terrorist groups as victims of terrorism. It's essential to address the needs of survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. In the immediate term, this includes upholding victims' rights and addressing their humanitarian needs. But it also requires the development and implementation of prosecution, rehabilitation and reintegration strategies that strengthen victim-centered approaches across a range of issues and recognize communities as key partners in the process of reintegration. Mr. President, as noted by the Secretary General in his 9th report, ISIL maintain significant residual wealth estimated to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Preventing ISIL and its supporters from raising, using and moving funds to support terrorist acts around the world remains a key component of international efforts to counter the group's threat. Therefore, during the last 6 months, the Security Council, supported by the Counterterrorism Committee and its Executive Directorate, has undertaken numerous activities aimed at countering the financing of terrorism. Following the January 2019 Area Formula meeting on preventing and countering the financing of terrorism, the Council adopted Resolution 2462, which is the first resolution focused solely on preventing and suppressing terrorism financing. Furthermore, the UN system, including CTED, has also sought to better understand the linkages between international terrorism, organized crime, and terrorism financing. In February, CTED published a study entitled Identifying and Exploring the Nexus Between Human Trafficking, Terrorism, and Terrorism Financing. And of course, just last month, the Council adopted its Resolution 2482, requiring member states to address those linkages. Mr. President, despite their military defeat, ISIL and its affiliates remain a significant threat. We therefore must remain vigilant innovative, adaptive, and proactive in our response. CTED will continue to work with its implementing partners, including member states, other UN entities, international and regional organizations, civil society, academia, and the private sector to ensure a holistic and effective approach to this complex threat to international peace and security. I do thank you, Mr. President.